I'm Ken Rimple, Chariot Solutions. I run our training and education services, and have been co-chairing the ET conference for, I guess, going on 3 or 4 years now, doing the AV stuff. So we're here to talk about Spring on the back end and JavaScript on the front end, also known as the mullet, right? Because you got the party in the back and business in the front. It's the 80s again. And 3 people laughed, and most people went, oh God, so perfect. That's what I'm going for today. So anyway, that's me.
I'm David Taransky. I'm a developer with Spring Source, longtime Java developer, and been using Spring since version 1.0. So we just celebrated our 10th anniversary. So hardly an emerging technology, but I think we're doing a lot of things to stay current, and we're going to show you some of that today.
So I'm just going to do roughly the same thing. I'm going to set up this link. Has everyone who wanted to play around with this gotten to the point where they hit the website? So it's bit.ly 17AX5 lowercase bt. Very easy to remember. However, it's because Ken did not get a domain name for this talk. So
you also have an opportunity to try and crash the app because
don't tell them
somewhat
that.
like the Romney campaign, we've never tested it with this many people before we went live.
That's rough. That sounds like a challenge, and I'm afraid of it. OK. So I'll put it back up again. I think I just heard someone ask. bit.ly 17A capital X5 lowercase bt.com. The pets.com people started that instead. So, all right. So if you haven't gone in yet, well, tell me, and I'll throw it back up there again. I have a little console here that I'm going to use to control it. It is clearly a developer's written console. You can see that I have absolutely beautiful skills in not doing good UI. But what we're doing here is just setting up a little bit of a quiz. And so we've actually preloaded the quizzes. We're storing them in MongoDB as just a JSON document. And we use it's funny, we've got a whole bunch of languages here. So we use Groovy to parse and load them in JSON format to throw them into the database. And then what we're doing is we're going to be using AngularJS on the front end, both to control the kind of the state of the application on the middle tier, which is Spring, and also to play the game. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call this the mullet talk. And this will be a JavaScript quiz for people who are Spring developers with JavaScript. So we'll hit Start Game. What should happen is when you go and you register your nickname, so we can call this anything. So I'm going to call this Rimple Guy. Hit Join Quizzo. It should come up and say, wait for a game. And if you logged in before this little game button shouldn't have appeared. But it should appear relatively rapidly afterwards. And the point being that this thing is checking every so often. We'll talk about short polling, long polling, and server-side push with WebSockets. We kind of have all 3 of those worked into this set of applications. So anyway, at this point, if you see the button, go ahead and hit click play.
I think on the Android, the page doesn't render really well. So over by the word game, there's a text box with a cursor in it where you enter your name.
Okay. So
and then you hit the go arrow on your keyboard.
Right.
Should work.
And then, so at this point, if you've gotten to the waiting of the other players, I'll just go ahead and start the game. Anyone still waiting? Probably not, I'm guessing. I'm just going to go ahead. So my really high-tech setup here, I begin gameplay. So at this point, it should flip the user interface to the first question, which I will just minimize a little bit. There we go. So go ahead and take your question answers. You just click on the button you think is the correct one. I'm using Twitter Bootstrap for the user interface because, again, I'm not a CSS designer, and that's a relatively easy one to use. So you see I use the hero unit in the middle, and I'm using the buttons with the width of whatever particular div there, and just kind of laying things out in little chunks on the screen. Really just a simple prototype kind of thing. By the way, if you're busy chatting, I'm almost frightened to click this, but ooh, I got a couple people here. Tim is online. Hey there. Hopefully this is working. Null undefined. All right. So, all right, as we try to hack this thing. So we go ahead and click on what you're supposed to inside which HTML element do we put the JavaScript. You click script, and then it's awaiting the next question. I then put your score up there. Everyone here should have a 10 on that one.
Got this one right.
We should. Okay, well, that's understandable because I didn't test it on Android. Hey! So, well, I shouldn't lie. I tested it on a tablet, but I didn't really pay attention to, hey, we're talking about Spring and JavaScript, not mobile. So put it this way, I was not planning on getting the responsive design working in time, unfortunately, because I did want to do that, actually. But I clearly did not. Boo! Yes. So while we're at it, let's go and fire up that other UI. We have to go in and grab the, so we also have a little console. Yeah. So give us a few seconds. We're going to grab this the little thing down below is just a UUID that we use for each of the games. And David wrote a WebSocket engine on Spring integration. So it wakes up and it gets stats from MongoDB and it broadcasts them out to any app that wants to listen on the WebSocket. So we're going to fire that server up. And then after we fire that server up, we're going to open up another panel and go back to it periodically as we do this. But meanwhile, I might as well just get you the next question. So we'll click on End Score Question and Next. And you should then get to the next question, which should be there. All right, so meanwhile, I'll do this while you're doing your question. I think I already grabbed that. But I'll do it anyway out of paranoid fear. Okay. All right, then we do the Maven. I'll just cat it. Hold on a second. Yeah. Hold on 1 second here. This will actually turn into a real talk in a few seconds. But we're just trying to show you like a simple example here to get started with. Maven exec. I just keep typing wrong. MVNEXEC Java. Spring profile equals default. Game ID equals doink. And then your other thing is the right. So what we're firing off now, so far this was just a simple MongoDB database with a Spring app in the middle. Spring app is keeping kind of basically session state for each of the users. And then it's serving up just a web application with Spring MVC. The web application is serving up just basically static JavaScript files and CSS and things like that. And so that's our application for the game. And the moderator is just communicating on a secure port, just a secure URL basically, sending web service messages along. This is going to be a separate Spring integration server. So Spring integration is an enterprise integration pattern server that is a free Spring framework platform. And who wrote the add-on for that, for integration?
Yeah, so this, if you've worked with Spring integration before, this is using an extension in the Spring integration extensions project on GitHub for TCP/IP adapters that was very simple to support WebSockets. So really we have an incoming TCP server, or a server listening on a socket on this port 8081. And with some very simple code to do the WebSocket handshake.
Okay, and then I'm going to go to QuizOWS, right?
Yeah.
And it should start.
Did you hit start already?
Yeah, I hit enter on the.
So we would have missed those first ones.
Okay, so we'll keep going. So, and this is going to get the WebSocket request and graph some output on who's taking what test. But anyway, moving on. All right, so anyway, so you get the cycle here. If I end and score a question and then move on to the next question, we're just going through a state machine, and that's pretty much it. So would I call this, you know, a super interactive application? Well, for a developer not spending a whole lot of time on it, it is for me, but it's not what you would see with a high-end AngularJS application. Nevertheless, it is all running on a client tier as a true client program with a true architecture. When you take a look at it, you can actually digest and understand and review. And so I think that's probably a good starting point. We can kind of just leave this where it is for the moment and kind of start up with the discussion. So let me pull up the slides.
We got some responses there.
I'm afraid to see it. Presentation, Vue.js, okay. All right, so I'm being a little flippant in this presentation just to kind of get things moving. So forgive the comments, I hope you're not taking them wrong, but why is it time to care about single-page web applications? I think a lot of Spring developers, and I'm going to be generalizing here, so correct me and throw things at me. Well, don't do that. But a lot of Spring developers are in platforms that are enterprise platforms. And in those enterprise platforms, things move a little slower. So you may be doing a lot of things in JSP, maybe you're moving to Timely for something else. And some JavaScript, maybe a lot of jQuery, perhaps. There's a ton of movement going on in the JavaScript community. You'll see it this week if you go to any of the other sessions in building true client-side applications in these what they call single-page web applications. So what we're getting at is a true three-tier client server. JavaScript in the front, Spring in the middle, as a middleware engine. Spring taking a little bit more of a role as data movement, and perhaps web services specifically. I mean, you will still want to validate things. You'll still have business processes in the middle tier, but some of the web logic that you're doing, well, that's a dangerous term. Some of the web logic that you're doing will no longer be things directed by JSPs with fragments of JavaScript on them, but truly driven by a JavaScript front end that's a true MVC platform. All right, so if you look, there's tons of projects going on, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're all of the highest quality, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's time to jump to a particular one. I picked AngularJS just because it was easy for me to understand and seemed to have a nice amount of support in the community. But you could do this with pretty much any of these if you're using Backbone, if you're using any of the other ones that are out there. But there's a lot of innovation happening in that sphere right now. It kind of reminds me of 2007, 2006. When Struts was the aging contender for getting out of being on the throne, so to speak, and so people were looking at do we do JSF, do we do Spring, do we do a few other things, and there were a number of web frameworks at that time, and so over those couple of year period, it kind of shook down to a lot of people are now doing Spring MVC. If they're not doing Spring MVC, they're probably doing Enterprise Java, and that's mostly what we see out there, at least in our community. The same thing is happening now. There's a ton of projects going on. In fact, if you take a look at a project called todomvc.com. This is a gentleman named Adi Osmani. This is a really, really, really good resource. Don Coleman from Chariot turned me on to this. And what it is a GitHub project where Adi and a number of other developers have contributed the same application written in a whole bunch of different flavors of MVC framework. Or I should say, JavaScript MVC framework. And so he has versions for Backbone, for Angular, for Ember, for Knockout, for Dojo, for YUI, and all these other ones. And it's just the same use case all the way through. So if I went to Backbone and clicked it, this is the to-do list application like, get started with code. Please stop talking, right? So it's just a simple to-do list. And then you can download all the source code, compare the source code in each of these frameworks, and figure out which ones make sense to you. I'd like to have seen it with more persistence, with a database, with relationships, with grids and things like that, but it's a good start at a bare minimum. So if you haven't seen any of these application frameworks before, I highly recommend you go to the todomvc.com site, get that GitHub project and dig through it and take a look at it and see what strikes your fancy. And it was through a suggestion from a friend of mine at work to take a look at Angular, as well as taking a look at the code of all these different ones as I was learning Backbone, and to me, not getting it, it seemed like it was very low level, that I clicked with AngularJS. So that's kind of my little story there. All right. And I'd like to talk up a couple talks. In the next talk in the same room is a full talk on AngularJS, specifically talking about the way of building components in Angular. And I'll show you one of them. For example, we do a little accordion for the chat. That's in AngularJS. They call them directives. So there's a talk about how to build those to kind of build a DSL around your HTML to add components. And then we have a JS panel that's going to be a really interesting kind of collection of people from Backbone and from Ember and from Angular and I forget the other one. Oh, Meteor. So. And all of these are based on the functional programming aspects. Who knew, 8 years ago, if you told me that, JavaScript is a super powerful functional language, well, I would have laughed and said browsers stink. Because back then, browsers really stank and they were slow and painful and buggy. Now they're painful and buggy, but they're fast. Kidding. But it's probably true. But at any rate, there's a lot of innovation going on with the hardware integration, with doing things like the PhoneGap folks are doing. You can do a lot in a browser these days. And so most people have been using it wrong for all those years. And I think everyone read the good parts and went, I can write a framework on this, and they all went and wrote a framework. It's my theory. Okay, so we did do the trivial example, the Quizzo application. Let's take a little bit of a look into the game architecture. And I'll do a few things in my slides, and I'll jump in through some code as well. All right. So the first thing is we're going to look at AngularJS. I flattened it out into 3 of the major components because it's going to look a lot like what you Spring developers are used to, and I'm a Spring developer too. So, dealing with views and controllers and services sounds a lot like Spring MVC controllers and services and views. Same concept. Okay, so you're going to have, in the technology space, we're going to have JavaScript for the controller. You're going to have a controller that looks like a piece of code. It doesn't look like HTML with code stuck in it. It's going to allow you to set up things on the entry of the page. It's going to allow you to add events to it. It's going to allow you to respond to things and click buttons and do all sorts of stuff and run back to the code, separate from the HTML. And then we have the services, which you would want to have the business logic within. And those services are generally stateful. Remember, they're running on the browser, so a little state in the browser, that's where your app's running. It's a client app, so it can hold state because it's doing it for just you. So stateful services, you can store variables in there if you want to and get them back again. And those services can then do things like calls to a RESTful resource or calls to an HTTP resource or whatever they need to do. And then around all this is what they call an Angular module or an application. I think that's close enough for Jazz probably to get started. Thank you, Lucas. Lucas is right in front of me. A couple other things in here too. So routers, there is a routing process that you'll set up, and it's essentially like most MVC applications. You have to say this URL goes here, this URL goes to this controller, this URL shows this controller in this view. So we'll be setting up a router in this, and I'll show you what the router looks like. And then beyond that, as I mentioned, directives. So I mentioned the controllers and services, directives. Directives are the things that are basically the special tags and special attributes that Angular pays attention to and either generates code for the HTML behind the scenes or binds events. So scope. Scope is an extremely important part of Angular. Scope is what they call a view model. In Spring MVC, we have a view model. It's called model view, right? And if you did XML Spring MVC, you used to create a model and view object, if you remember that, before we just threw things into return values and maps. But a view model is what you are going to expose to the view that you've consciously decided that you want to put in to be viewed by the page. All right, so that's things out of scopes. Things like values to show on the screen, which you're used to, but methods to call when we click a button or we select something. So you're calling JavaScript functions that way, and you're also accessing variables. One thing about Angular that's really cool is that it's an instant data binding, two-way data binding. If I change data in the scope and I have it bound somewhere on a piece of a page, like a field, it instantly changes that field. And if I change the field, it instantly changes the stuff on the back. So that's an important part of this whole thing. So we put it all together. It sure looks a lot like something you've done before, only I turned it on its side just to be really obnoxious. Look, it's on its side. It's different. Point being that you've got your user interface in Angular, which is just another MVC, with all the power of the browser, running on a browser, communicating with something like JSON. JSON's a very good format to use out of the box because it's understandable very easily by Angular and by web browsers. And we can certainly work with JSON and Spring MVC. We just load the JSON Jackson library. And once we've booted that thing up and we turn on our Spring MVC support for it, we can use serialization annotations for JSON to control how we turn things into JSON and understand them and decrypt them from JSON. I shouldn't say decrypt, but decode them, so to speak. All right. So it's a pretty complete framework. I've already mentioned the first two, but it's a pretty complete framework, but it's not so opinionated that you absolutely have to develop a certain way. And so you'll see that when we look at the code. So any questions so far before we get any further along? Okay. Enough preamble, Ken, right? Hopefully you can see this. Let me just zoom it in a little bit. So this is an Angular module. It's a very extracted Angular module because you can only fit so much on a HTML screen. But you can see here that we've got an Angular module with the name of Quizzo app. That's this first thing at the very top. We then can inject dependencies or libraries that we're going to use, features that we're going to access that are Angular libraries, I guess other modules essentially. And the UI Bootstrap one is an Angular one that provides us tags for all the little Twitter Bootstrap objects that you can build, like accordions and panels and things like that, and dialogues. I had to have an excuse to use it, so I actually use it for a little chat to hide the chat. It's just using a single entry accordion, just to cheat, completely abusing that feature. And then you'll see below that, we have this config entry. And the config entry says, I'm going to configure AngularJS, and I'm going to provide information as it's booting up. So this is kind of like your startup block. And we actually are injecting what they call Angular services. These $ things are called Angular services. So we're injecting a route provider and an HTTP provider. The reason you see them as strings above is because you can alias them to variables in the code that are different. So I'm just using the syntax of, here's the name of it in Angular's config, and in the code I'm calling it route provider. I happen to be using the same name. So maybe I'm kind of doing that a little superfluously, but I think one of the things I think that helps with is when you do minification, it doesn't screw up the symbols because your actual variable's moving around. So there's a little bit of syntax that might be hard to wrap your head around early on. But the function basically does whatever we ask it to. And one of the things we'll ask it to do is set up the route provider. The route provider is your router. So you see two routes here. I have about 7 or 8, maybe 9 in our application. And basically it's a little a Fluent API. So you'll say, route provider.when, and we say we hit register. I should mention that register is not a server-side browse. Register is a # HTML browse. In fact, let me just jump over to the app briefly here and show you. When we actually hit this thing and we go somewhere, let me actually go to the Quizzo itself. So there's an example. So that little # is client-side browser location. You can bookmark it depending on if it actually knows how to recover itself, and work in that bookmark. You could certainly bookmark that URL, and as long as it properly puts itself back together again by hitting it, you could literally go back to that bookmark. But it's #/play, and it will support, I guess there's an HTML5 version of the same thing without the pound. You can turn that on, and certain browsers will honor that. So this is just purely a client-side URL route. We don't go back to the server for this. I don't know what I'm doing. Some days. Yes. Okay. So let's look at one of these routes. When register, the template we're going to show, and I'll show you where we put the template in a second, but we're going to show a template, basically a file that's going to be rendered like a JSP or like something else. If you've done any research in JavaScript or something else, it's like handlebars or mustache templates. So these are just things that get loaded in, and they get parsed, and they get substituted with values that we put in our models. So we have one for assign player up there, and that's the one basically where you key in your player name and hit go, essentially hit register. And then we want to tell it the controller to use. The controller initializes the view, sets everything up. We'll interact with the services if it needs to load things from the database, whatever you want to do, and then essentially gives the view to the user. So that's the register controller. And I'm using the shorthand of CTRL. I've seen a lot of documentation do that. I'm not sure if that's the going standard anymore, but that's pretty much what they use, is CTRL for the shorthand in all the websites you'll see examples from. And we have another one for when join game. You'll see this is a RESTful URL here. We see join game / game ID. And we can pluck that ID off later using an Angular object that will parse these out. So we'll take a look at that a little later. And the same thing, when we join the game, we go to the, so this is requesting joining of a game. We want to show some sort of waiting page, right? Until you've actually joined the game, we don't want to put you in the game. So we're actually going to go to the joining game view, and we'll run the join game controller, which spawns off the call, and then when it comes back, wakes up and moves it forward. Essentially, that's the process. And we can keep going on with all these different whens. And in fact, if I were to look at this, if I look at the application itself in here briefly, and I learn how to use the keyboard. Quizzo.js, app, scripts, app.js. Here's the actual one. All right, so, doesn't quite fit well on a slide. And this is all on GitHub, by the way. You can download the code, hack with it, make it much better than it is today. Do whatever you want, fork it. And you'll see there's even an otherwise in here. If we don't find a proper route, we go somewhere else, which I added that so that I could actually recover from someone hitting refresh on the browser. And it's reasonably good at doing that right now. Okay, so that's an example of one. Another choice thing that you have to worry about is if you do any kind of server-side state, meaning state inside of a session in Spring, Angular by default is stateless. So you have to tell it to pay attention to state. That default with credentials is the way that you get it to pay attention to cookies and actually use memory cookies for your server sessions. It took me a good day and a half to find that feature. But at least it was there for me to use. All right, so that's the routes. So we've configured a module, and in configuring the module, we set up our different URLs, our controllers, and views. Question in the back? Where does this code live? This code lives actually on a web server as downloaded code. So there's an index.html file. That index.html file will download all these JavaScripts. And so you can kind of compress and minify them and concatenate them together, which is what we'll do at the end of this. But yeah, it's essentially JavaScript code that lives on the client in the browser. So when does it get run? It gets run when you open the page up that has the boot up of Angular in it. So you'll have this is why they call them single page web applications or SPAs. It's because that page will boot everything up. And so as part of booting it up, Angular boots up and Angular reads the instructions, sets up the routes. Okay, it takes tenths of a second, hundredths of a second to a second, depending on how complex it is, obviously, to boot it up, and then it's ready to work. All right. Here's a controller. It's an extremely small version of a controller. So we've got our module again. You'll notice that all of these components generally start with angular.module and the name of the module, dot, and then the feature, like controller, service, resource, that kind of thing. And so we're going to create a controller called register controller here. Register controller is the one we're referring to in one of the routes before. And then we declare a function. And that function is essentially what sets up the controller and sets up all the functions inside of it. Now, unlike Java, where you constantly have to create a class and extend the class and then create another subclass and extend the class and do all that kind of stuff, we're just adding functions to other objects. You have an object that's made of JavaScript that just you add functions to. And you can pass those objects around. You don't have to worry about inheritance necessarily. And you just kind of add a feature. I think we were talking about that last night. Just kind of add a feature to the language by just throwing a function in there. So it's easier to extend and change these frameworks because you're not bound by all the ceremony Java has. So we have to take a look here. We're injecting a few features called scope. So we can write things to scope and have them immediately available to us in our page. And so we're injecting that, and it does dependency injection, so it automatically will find that Angular service and inject it. So the scope service is available to me. The location service, which is our ability to change the path of the template that we're showing, go to another route. That's how we change pages in Angular, or change views, essentially, is the term for them. And then also we have our own service called the register player service. And so that's the thing that's going to be doing its stuff. I'm keeping track of the time, so I'm not going to run out. So what we're doing here is we're setting up